Picture this. You're stuck in a scorching Egyptian hallway, the air thick with incense and the faint scent of rotting papyrus, and a thunderous voice announces, "I am now something else." Hey guys, before we get lost in the sand storm of dynasties, smash that like button if you love a good identity crisis, and drop a comment telling me the craziest name change you've survived. Dim the lights, grab a cold drink, maybe something that doesn't melt in the desert heat, and settle in. Because we're about to stalk the only ruler who treated his own throne like a series of rebranding campaigns. You feel the cool stone of his marble tomb under your fingertips. Hear the echo of scribes muttering. Did he really just rewrite his titulary again? It's as if he swapped out his royal Twitter handle 5 times, each iteration louder than the last, leaving Egypt's bureaucracy sighing like a cat stuck in a laundry basket. So, which of his 5 monikers will stick in your memory? And what would you call yourself if you could change your name whenever you felt like it? Let us know below. At dawn, the river swelled with a soft amber glow, and the procession of attendants slipped quietly along the fertile banks as Prince Neferek stepped onto the stone platform. The murmurs of the crowd settled like dust after a breeze when the high priest, his face hidden in the shadow of the headdress, spoke of a fragile future that required the king to reshape his name. The news of the former pharaoh's sudden death lingered in the air, a faint metallic scent of incense that seemed to cling to the stone walls. Neferek felt the weight of the crown settle against his temples, cool marble against skin, while the reeds whispered a tentative welcome. The priest's prophecy lingered, a quiet echo that promised the throne would endure only if the king listened to the shifting will of the unseen gods. In the days that followed, the palace corridors filled with the rustle of linen and the low murmur of courtiers debating the meaning of the priest's words. Neferek paced the cool, tiled courtyard, his sandals tracing faint circles in the sand as he considered the first alteration of his name. The scribe hesitated over the ink, the nib trembling like a reed caught in a gentle current, while the steward offered a cup of warm barley water that steamed softly in the evening air. Whispers grew louder, the candle flames flickering in rhythm with the rising tension as advisors suggested names that honored past victories. Yet each suggestion seemed to echo against the stone pillars, returning as a hollow sound that left the king feeling more uncertain than resolved. When the new name was finally etched onto the limestone doorway, a subtle irony settled over the palace like a thin layer of dust. The change was meant to align the throne with divine favor, but the very next morning, the grain stores reported a minor spoilage that dulled the expected celebration. The priest, still unseen behind the veil of shadow, watched the workers sweep the floor, his fingers brushing the cool tiles without a word of reassurance. Laughter half hushed, drifted from the kitchen where cooks stirred lentil soup, the aroma warm and comforting against the backdrop of bureaucratic delay. The king observed the small absurdities, a broken reed used as a pen, a statue of a forgotten deity slipping slightly from its base, realizing that the god's will was perhaps no more predictable than the Nile's own tides. With time, the kingdom settled into a rhythm as steady as the river's pulse, and Neferek found calm in the ordinary motions of daily rule. He watched artisans shape clay pots, their fingers damp and steady, and felt the gentle vibration of looms as they produced fine linen that brushed against his hands. The palace gardens, fragrant with jasmine and papyrus, offered a quiet space where the king could contemplate without the pressure of prophecy, the breeze carrying a soft rustle of leaves. The priest's occasional counsel arrived like a distant drumbeat, soft, infrequent, and always with his face concealed in dim light, allowing Neferek to make the next name change at his own measured pace. The throne endured, not through grand declarations, but through the steady cadence of meals shared, work completed, and the night sky sighing over the sand dunes. In the later years of his reign, Neferek would sit on the low stone bench and watch the sunset bleed orange across the horizon, the air cooling as the day's heat faded. He reflected on the series of names he had carried, each a thin veneer over the same steady heart that guided the kingdom's modest triumphs. The faint echo of the priest's blurred silhouette lingered in his memory, a reminder that the divine was often more a whisper than a command. He understood that the true endurance of the throne lay not in aligning with shifting will, but in the patient acceptance of life's small imperfections. As the night settled, the palace lights dimmed, and the soft creak of wooden doors marked the quiet continuation of a story that was, at its core, merely human. In the first light of his reign, Neferek stood on the moss-soft stone of his courtyard, his sandals barely stirring the dust that clung to the air. The quiet murmur of the palace staff moving between the columns sounded like a slow tide, each step measured and unhurried. He watched the Nile's surface ripple under a thin veil of morning mist, feeling the weight of a name that had been handed down through generations. Though the kingdom stretched far beyond the horizon, the young ruler felt the familiar pull of ordinary concerns, laundry drying on rope, the scent of herbs simmering in the kitchen. It was a calm that seemed to promise steadiness, as if time itself were easing into a comfortable sigh. A terse message arrived from Upper Egypt, its papyrus edges rough, bearing the inked mark of a restless town that had taken up arms. The sound of marching drums rose from the south, a low thrum that vibrated through the palace walls, and into the stone floor. In response, Neferek took a breath that seemed to carry the scent of incense, and he whispered a new name, Amenhotep, into the crowded hall, his voice barely louder than the rustle of linen. The troops gathered, their bronze shields catching the dim light, and moved like a slow river toward the fortified city. The siege unfolded under a sky that grew cooler, each clang of metal echoing the tension that now settled over the land, while the name change rang through the camps like a tentative promise of unity. When the walls fell and the banners were lowered, the priests entered the cracked corridors, their faces hidden in shadows that filtered the weak firelight. Their murmurs were low, a mixture of reverence and thinly veiled disdain, as they regarded the name Amenhotep as a gilded veneer over old ambitions. The scent of oil lamps mingled with the faint metallic taste of blood, while a lone scribe traced the newly inscribed cartouche with a careful hand, his fingers trembling just enough to betray his unease. The priest's silent protest was felt in the subtle stiffness of ceremonial robes, a quiet irony that the attempt to rally divine favor had instead spotlighted human vanity. Yet the city's streets remained hushed, the occasional clink of pottery against stone, a reminder that daily life persisted despite the undercurrent of dissent. In the weeks that followed, the market stalls along the riverbank began to fill with traders arranging figs, barley, and woven baskets, their voices low and rhythmic like a whispered lullaby. The sun set amber gold, bathing the sandstone walls in a gentle warmth that seemed to smooth over the recent turbulence. Soldiers, now idle, rested on the cool mud of the courtyard, their armor sighing as they lowered their shields, while children chased each other with wooden hoops, their laughter a soft percussion against the evening. The priests, still cloaked in anonymity, observed from the shadows of pillars, their solemn steps barely disturbing the dust, as if acknowledging the fleeting nature of power. In that stillness, the name Amenhotep settled into the stone, becoming another quiet layer of the palace's history, unnoticed by those who simply tended to the fire and the food. Years later, as the kingdom's borders stretched and contracted like the breath of a sleeping giant, the former pharaoh would once more change his name. Each alteration a modest echo of his earlier attempt at unity. The palace halls grew quieter, the echo of footsteps softened by the thickening dust, and the once vivid inscriptions now appeared as faded stories on cracked walls. Visitors to the tombs would pause, feeling the cool stone under their fingertips, and sense the lingering irony that a ruler's search for identity was as fleeting as the night's breeze. In the soft glow of oil lamps, the blurred silhouettes of ancient priests seemed to watch, their faces forever hidden, as if aware that history remembers more the pauses between events than the events themselves. The final sigh of the pharaohs, rain lingered like the last note of a lullaby, leaving a gentle reminder that even grand names dissolve into the ordinary cadence of human days. The young ruler, known by his birth name, surveyed the riverbank as the sun painted the limestone walls a soft amber. He listened to the steady rhythm of oars and the distant murmur of market stalls, feeling the cool breeze stir the papyrus scrolls in the palace courtyard. The kingdom moved with a measured patience, its bakers kneading dough, scribes sharpening reeds, and children playing beside the Nile's edge. In these quiet mornings, the weight of future decisions felt distant, like a shadow on the far sand dunes. The throne room remained uncluttered, its stone floor warm under bare feet, as the pharaoh settled into the first modest chapter of his reign. When a horde of bronze-clad strangers slipped across the desert, the clatter of foreign chariots rattled the palace shutters, and the scent of dust entered the halls. The king, now calling himself Seti, pressed his palm to the cool basalt wall and whispered a plea to the hidden face of the war god Set, his eyes fixed on a shaft of light that kept the deity's features in shadow. Soldiers gathered at the riverbank, their shields gleaming faintly, and the crack of spears rang like distant thunder, buying a brief pause. The invaders turned back as the tide rose, their banners slipping into the sand, and the air cooled with the sigh of relief that lingered over the granaries. Yet the triumph felt as fragile as the reed reeds in the palace gardens, and the people returned to their chores with a muted steadiness. The victory, though celebrated with a modest feast of figs and flatbread, left the courtiers aware of the kingdom's thin margin of safety. The next season, the throne room echoed with the rustle of plans, and the ruler adopted the name Ramesses, promising the sun god Ra, whose visage remained hidden behind a veil of bright heat, a line of towering stone that would reach the horizon. Artisans set stone blocks upon wheeled sleds, their muscles straining in the quiet heat, while the distant clink of chisels became the new soundtrack of the capital. Yet each newly raised column seemed to cast longer shadows over the fields, and the laborers' sand-stained hands trembled from exhaustion rather than pride. The sun blazed over the unfinished pylon, its light turning the limestone to a soft amber that softened the edges of the towering ambitions. As the workers paused for a cooling drink of barley water, the courtiers exchanged weary smiles, aware that the promised grandeur was a promise made to a deity whose hidden face offered no immediate comfort. The kingdom's resources thinned like the narrow strip of sand between two dunes, and the monumental dream settled into a slow, relentless routine, with the great obelisks rising slowly, The city settled into a rhythm as steady as the Nile's annual flood. Children chased crickets along the courtyard walls, while the scent of cumin and lentil stew drifted from humble kitchens, and the stone workers rested on cool stone benches, feeling the evening's chill settle over their backs. Market sellers arranged baskets of dates, their hands brushing the grainy sand, and the distant chant of a scribe's reed pen provided a gentle background hum. The royal court, now accustomed to the weight of titles, held meetings under a canopy of woven reeds, their discussions measured, their gestures unhurried. In the soft glow of oil lamps, the people found brief moments of laughter, their voices low, as the kingdom continued its labor beneath a sky turning a muted violet. Later historians, tracing the layers of renaming etched into faded cartouches, noted how each title had offered a fleeting shield against chaos, yet left the administration increasingly weary. They observed the blurred silhouettes of deities in temple reliefs, their faces forever hidden, mirroring the unseen pressures that guided the pharaoh's decisions. The archives revealed ledger pages stained with ink and sweat, recording the dwindling grain stores and the slow pace of construction, a testament to human endurance rather than divine favor. In quiet contemplation, scholars now speak of the kingdom's fatigue as a lesson, that the pursuit of grandeur can mask the subtle erosion of daily sustenance. The story concludes not with a triumphant crescendo, but with the soft rustle of papyrus and the gentle sigh of wind over desert dunes, reminding listeners that history moves on, patient and slightly amused by its own patterns. The sun rose over the cracked mud brick houses of Thebes as the 8th king of the dynasty watched the fields dry like parchment. Grain stores, once swollen, now whispered of emptiness when the wind brushed the empty sacks. Merchants shuffled their wares with sighs, and the river's edge held a thin veil of mist that carried the scent of dust. In the palace courtyard, servants moved slowly, their sandals stirring the cool sand, while the ruler's eyes lingered on the empty horizon. The kingdom, accustomed to the rhythm of flood and harvest, now felt a pause, as if history itself inhaled before the next chapter. Soon the quiet gave way to murmurs in the market, where traders exchanged not only goods, but uneasy glances, their voices low like the creak of ancient doors. A rival claimant, cloaked in plain linen, appeared at the city gates, his claims spoken in a voice that trembled like a reed in the wind. The royal guard tightened the leather straps of their spears, and the palace drums beat a slower, heavier rhythm, echoing the tension in the palace hall. Outside, children paused their games of knucklebones, their eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the palace walls. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint scent of burnt incense from the temple, a reminder of rites that now seemed distant and uncertain. In response, the king stepped onto the low stone platform of the council chamber and announced his new title, Thutmose, the Reckoner of Balance, his voice steady as the stone beneath his feet. He ordered the redistribution of grain measured by simple wooden blocks, a modest reform that seemed both earnest and oddly bureaucratic. Scribes recorded the decrees with ink that spread slowly across parchment, each stroke a quiet testament to order amid chaos. The irony was not lost on the courtiers, who noted how a man of divine lineage now counted grains as a farmer might, their smiles barely stirring the shadows over their faces. Yet the people, accustomed to endless cycles, felt a faint steadiness in the measured clink of scales, a soft reassurance that some balance might return. The rivals' forces gathered at the foot of the temple of Horus, where the stone lion statues cast long, cool shadows that stretched across the sand like quiet guardians. At dawn, the two camps faced one another, the only sounds the rustle of linen and the occasional clang of a distant pot. When the clash began, spears met shields with a muted thud, and the dust rose in slow, swirling clouds that caught the early light. After a measured exchange, the king's troops withdrew to a low ridge, allowing the sun to warm the stone floor of the temple, where the blurred outlines of priests observed in silence. The rivals' banner fell limp, and the calm after the battle settled over the courtyard like a soft blanket. The only movement, a gentle breeze stirring the palm fronds. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom settled into a rhythm of careful sowing. The fields now tended under the watchful eyes of laborers who counted each seed with reverence. The king, still named Thutmose, walked among the workers, his sandals leaving faint impressions in the damp earth, his presence a quiet anchor for the people. Evening markets resumed their chatter, the clink of pottery and the scent of fresh bread mingling with the distant call of a nightjar. Children resumed their games, their laughter a low hum that blended with the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls being read by scholars. As the night deepened, the pharaoh retired to his chambers, his thoughts lingering on the balance he had sought, a reminder that history often moves not in grand gestures, but in the patient accumulation of small, ordinary acts. In the waning heat of a summer morning, the young ruler stepped onto the cracked limestone of the palace courtyard, his sandals stirring dust that rose like lazy clouds. He listened to the muted chatter of scribes polishing reeds, their pens scratching soft notes on papyrus, as the sun painted the walls with amber. With a measured sigh, he declared his first name, a modest echo of his father's lineage, as if planting a seed in familiar soil. The courtiers, eyes half closed from the heat, nodded politely, their hands resting on cool stone columns. In that stillness, the future felt as pliable as the barley swaying beyond the garden walls. Months passed, and the kingdom faced a quiet strain. The Nile's flood arrived a foot lower than expected, and the granaries whispered of scarcity. The ruler, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, altered his name, adopting a title that whispered of strength and resilience, as if to coax the waters to rise. He walked the market stalls, feeling the roughness of woven baskets and the cool bite of stone statues under his palm, while merchants muttered about the changing tides. The weight of his new name settled like a stone in his throat. Yet the city moved on, its rhythm unchanged, the distant hymn of laborers striking brick echoing in the dusk. The tension lingered like heat on a tin roof, unspoken but palpable, when the priests presented a scroll bearing the symbol of a falcon. The ruler's eyes flickered, recognizing the irony of a man who reshaped his identity, while the world kept its ancient cycles. He added a third name, a subtle nod to the sun's journey across the sky, as if to align his reign with the predictable arc that the farmers trusted. The ceremony unfolded in the cool shade of a colonnade, the murmurs of incense barely reaching the ears of the silent statues, whose faces remained blurred by the play of light. Observers exchanged half smiles, aware that a title could be both armor and performance. The irony lay in the quiet acceptance that even the most deliberate name change could not silence the whisper of stone beneath their feet. With the seasons settling into a gentle lull, the ruler sensed a calm that felt earned rather than given. He bestowed upon himself a fourth name, one that whispered of harmony, and ordered the artisans to craft a modest garden beside the river, where reeds brushed against stone benches. The scent of earth after rain mingled with the soft rustle of papyrus leaves, and the palace servants moved with deliberate slowness, their footsteps barely stirring the sand. In this measured peace, the kingdom's pulse slowed, and the ruler watched the reflection of the setting sun glide across the water, feeling his own breath synchronize with the evening breeze. The calm settled like a thin veil, neither triumphant nor sorrowful, just a quiet acknowledgement of endurance. As twilight deepened, the ruler adopted his final name, invoking Osiris, the keeper of the afterlife, and commissioned a mortuary complex that blended stone and shadow in equal measure. The workers, their hands dusted with fine limestone, placed each block with a soft thud, the distant chant of hidden priests barely audible through the stone corridors. Succession passed to his eldest son without dispute, the transition marked by a muted feast where figs and barley soup warmed tired limbs. The legend of the 5 named Pharaoh lingered, not as a boastful tale, but as a gentle reminder that adaptability can be a quiet strength, like the slow river that never rushes yet shapes the land. In the lingering hush, the palace walls seemed to exhale, holding the story like a warm blanket against the night. In the early winter of the sunlit dynasty, Li Shen stepped onto the marble dais of the palace of Kian, his hand resting lightly on the cool stone rail. The courtiers whispered his new title, Emperor Tianlong, as lantern light flickered on their polished armor. With a modest smile, he signed edicts that lowered the grain tax and ordered the repair of cracked canals, the sound of water returning to dry fields. Farmers in the northern provinces watched the sunrise over newly plowed fields, feeling the earth turn once more beneath their boots. The air held a promise, a steady breath that seemed to announce a golden age waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet the quiet optimism met the rustle of dissent as provincial lords, accustomed to a slower pace, gathered in shadowed taverns to mutter about lost privileges. The clatter of swords being sharpened echoed through the mountain passes, and the scent of smoke rose from villages where soldiers collected overdue tribute. Tianlong's reforms, though well-intended, forced a sudden shift in the rhythm of market stalls, leaving merchants clutching empty purses and children staring at closed shutters. The palace gardens, once a place of serene contemplation, now hummed with hurried messengers delivering urgent reports. Tension settled like a low mist over the capital, each breath heavier than the last. In the midst of that tension, a small irony unfolded as the very officials appointed to oversee the reforms began to hoard the grain they were meant to distribute, their robes rustling with hidden bundles. The sound of their clandestine meetings was masked by the steady drip of rain against the palace roofs, each drop a reminder of forgotten promises. Even the imperial scholars, who had once praised the emperor's vision, now scribbled footnotes that softened the grand narrative into a series of cautious advisories. Tianlong watched from his study, the lacquered desk cool beneath his fingertips, as the city's rhythm adjusted to a new, slower tempo. The grand name of Heavenly Dragon seemed to waver, its echo softened by the mundane choreography of daily bureaucracy. As seasons turned, the frantic pulse of the early rain settled into a steadier cadence, the clamor of protests giving way to the sigh of turning wheels in workshops. Artisans in the east resumed the gentle tapping of chisels, the scent of fresh lacquer filling the quiet alleys, while children chased fireflies near the riverbank. The emperor's own footsteps grew slower, each stride accompanied by the soft rustle of his silk sleeves against the stone corridor floor. Evening, lanterns cast a warm amber glow over the courtyard, where tea was poured slowly, steam rising like quiet thoughts. In that calm, the realm of Cayenne seemed to accept its imperfections, finding comfort in the ordinary rhythm of lived days. Looking back, the era of Tianlong appears as a prelude to the later chapters of a ruler who would later adopt 3 additional names, each a layer added to the same worn cloak of authority. The quiet museums of memory hold faded scrolls that record his reforms, the murmurs of dissent, and the soft laughter of families gathering around low tables. History, ever patient, notes how even the most lofty titles are brushed by the texture of daily life, a farmer's calloused hand, a scholar's ink-stained fingertip, the distant hum of a river that never truly stops. In the end, the emperor's legacy rests not on grand proclamation, but on the subtle, lingering scent of tea leaves and the faint imprint of footsteps on palace stone. The story settles into a gentle sigh, reminding us that the passage of power is as much about small, steady breaths as it is about thunderous decrees. In the chilled twilight of the imperial courtyard, Li Shen walked among the lacquered pillars, his breath forming thin clouds against the stone. The scent of sandalwood incense lingered, mingling with the distant clatter of court scribes sharpening brushes. He wore the jade brocade of his first regnal name, a quiet reminder of a lineage that had steadied the realm for centuries. Servants passed tea in delicate porcelain cups, their soft clink a metronome to his measured thoughts. The world beyond the walls seemed distant, as if the empire itself were a well-kept secret, waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. When the northern clang of war drums reached the foot of the great wall, a thin line of dust rose, scattering the lantern light into trembling shadows. The breach was sudden, a cold wind slipping through the cracked stones, carrying with it the scent of horse, sweat, and distant pine. Li Shen, now compelled to set aside his ancestral title, lifted a crimson banner emblazoned with the character Yuzhai, its fabric rustling like a whispered promise. He gathered the council in a hall where the heat from the hearth rose in lazy swirls, each member's eyes flickering between fear and resolve. The emperor's voice, low and steady, called for unity even as the night outside grew louder with the distant roar of distant hooves. Alliances formed in that dim room felt as fragile as the paper scrolls spread across the low table, their edges frayed by whispered doubts. A minister who had once whispered counsel now slipped a silver dagger into his own sleeve. Its coldness, a quiet irony against the warm tea he pretended to sip. The northern chieftains arrived on horseback, their armor glinting like sunrise on a river. Yet Their eyes held the same weary calculation as the emperor's own. A reluctant truce was brokered with the exchange of grain sacks and muted curses, the sound of rice grains spilling onto the floor, echoing the soft clatter of broken agreements. In the background, a blurred silhouette of a sage lingered, hidden by shadow, offering no prophecy, only the steady hum of an unspoken understanding of human folly. Days softened into a muted amber as the council settled into a tentative rhythm, the crackle of the fire becoming the background to quiet negotiations. Li Shen, now fully vested in the name Yuzhai, walked the palace corridors with a slower gait, feeling the cool marble beneath his sandals and the faint draft from open windows that tugged at his robe. The court's meals were served in simple bowls, the steam rising in lazy curls, each spoonful a reminder that survival rested on ordinary acts. Even the distant war drums faded into a low thrum, like a heartbeat heard through stone walls, allowing space for contemplation. The emperor listened to the soft footfalls of servants, the rustle of silk, and the occasional sigh of a weary soldier, letting each sound settle like sediment in a still pond. In the hush of the waning moon, Li Shen stood on the balcony, his silhouette blurring against the dimming sky, contemplating the path that had reshaped his reign. The empire's borders, once drawn in ink, now seemed etched in the memory of countless small gestures, a shared bowl of broth, a whispered apology, a repaired fence. The weight of 4 names rested lightly on his shoulders, as if the titles were merely layers of worn cloth, each offering a different texture to the same body. He felt a gentle melancholy for the moments lost to ambition, yet also a quiet gratitude for the steady cadence of ordinary days that had carried his people through. The night air, cool and fragrant with jasmine, settled around him like a soft blanket, reminding him that history, like sleep, moves forward in measured, unhurried breaths. The summer heat clung to the capital's stone walls as the first murmurs of the plague drifted through the market stalls. Grain carts creaked, and the scent of simmering soup filled the narrow alleys. Yet faces were pale, and eyes lingered on empty bowls. In the jade hall, the emperor stood beside a low wooden screen, his lacquered shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. He announced a new regnal name, Rainshi, and slipped a plain cotton veil over his crown, as if to hide the weight of the crown itself. The court whispered that humility was a thin veil, but the emperor's voice remained steady, a soft rustle against the distant coughs outside. The disease thickened, turning the river's mist into a slow, choking fog that settled over the southern provinces. Lanterns flickered in homes where rebels gathered, their chants muffled by the night wind that brushed the shutters. Envoys arrived with sealed letters. Their wax seals cracked as if the heat had softened them, bearing reports of grain shortages and whispered plots against the throne. Soldiers marched in the courtyard, boots thudding on the stone, while the emperor's own guards exchanged uneasy glances. Even the palace cooks paused, their knives hovering over dough, as the scent of incense seemed too thin to mask the growing unease. Against this backdrop, the emperor resolved to journey to the sacred mountains, a pilgrimage traditionally reserved for the unborn or the dying, now repurposed as a plea for mercy. He wrapped a simple reed cloak around his shoulders, the fabric rustling like dry leaves, and set out with a handful of attendants, whose laughter was as muted as the steps of a funeral procession. The path wound through wheat fields that swayed, indifferent to the political tremors, while distant drums of dissent thumped faintly beyond the horizon. At each village, the emperor paused to taste plain millet porridge, his veil catching stray sunlight, and turning his face into a shadowed silhouette that no one could read. Ironically, the very anonymity he sought seemed to draw the attention of courtiers, who whispered that a concealed ruler could command more respect than a gilded one. The mountain ascent unfolded in quiet, the air growing cooler as the emperor climbed the stone steps worn by pilgrims of centuries. Pines released a faint piney scent that mingled with the lingering incense from a shrine at the summit, where the altar stone was veiled in soft shadows, the faces of the holy hidden by the dim glow. He sat on a low wooden bench, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, and listened to the distant call of a lone crane, its cry echoing gently across the valley. The wind brushed his veil, fluttering it like a page of old parchment, while the sky turned a muted amber, neither harsh nor bright. In that still moment, the emperor's thoughts settled like dust on an ancient scroll. The clamor of the empire reduced to the steady beat of his own heart. Returning to the capital, the emperor carried no grand decree, only a quiet resolve that resonated in the soft rustle of bamboo screens. He ordered communal ovens to be opened at dawn, allowing families to bake together, the heat of the fire warming more than just bread, but the fractured spirit of the city. In the council hall, the veil remained loosely draped over his crown, a reminder that authority could be cloaked in modesty without losing its shape. As the night settled, the palace courtyard filled with the faint scent of jasmine, and the distant hum of a single lute played a lullaby that seemed to soothe the lingering coughs of the sick. The emperor gazed at the stars reflected in the still pond, understanding that power, like daylight, is transient, and that humility can be the most enduring shelter against the storm. The imperial capital lay in the soft glow of late afternoon, its tiled roofs shimmering like quiet parchment. Within the palace, the ruler had been known successively as Tianjai, Dawang, Xingzhen, and most recently Yulong, each name a thin veneer that the courtiers adjusted to with polite deference. Scholars recorded the changes in hushed ink, noting how the emperor's voice grew steadier with each transition, though the corridors retained the faint echo of earlier titles. Citizens moved through the market stalls, unaware that the shifting names were a response to restless boarders and whispered petitions. The city's rhythm remained unaltered, a slow metronome of footsteps and distant water wheels as winter pressed its chill against the western walls. The sound of distant drums rose from the river valley, heralding the approach of rebel forces. Soldiers in rust-stained armor tightened the bolts on wooden gates, their breath forming mist in the early sunrise. The emperor, now seated on a low lacquered throne, watched the maps unfold, feeling the thin paper tremble under his fingertip. Around the courtyard, lanterns were lit one by one, casting a warm amber that did little to heat the growing unease. Yet the palace staff continued their ritual of steaming buns, each soft puff a small act of continuity amid the looming threat. On the third day of the siege, the ruler lifted his hand, and the assembled commanders heard a new proclamation. Emperor Wuhong, the fifth sovereign, a name that seemed both culmination and jest. The warcry that followed, a low chant echoing the river's murmur, united the scattered legions as if a forgotten lullaby had resurfaced. Ironically, Liu Xin, the rebel general, stepped forward not with sword drawn, but with a folded parchment, the same script he had once delivered as a diplomatic envoy. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and for a moment the clamor of battle softened into a quiet acknowledgement of shared history. The moment lingered like a breath held at the edge of a door, both absurd and solemn. The clash unfolded in measured cadence. Steel met shield with a muted clang that sounded more like a sigh than a scream. Dust rose from the courtyard stones, settling slowly like ash after a candle is extinguished, while the sun slipped behind low clouds, cooling the air to a comfortable hush. Amid the fray, the emperor's banner, a simple crimson cloth, fluttered unevenly, its threadbare edges catching a faint wind that seemed to carry the scent of rain. When Liu Xin finally lowered his sword, the battlefield fell into a gentle stillness, punctuated only by the distant coo of pigeons returning to their nests. The surviving soldiers, tired and ink-stained, gathered around the wounded, sharing broth in silence as the siege's roar faded into memory. In the aftermath, the emperor removed the ceremonial crown, placing it on a low wooden chest, his hands trembling not from fatigue, but from the awareness of the masks he had worn. The 4 regnal names, now catalogued on a single scroll, revealed a pattern of adaptation rather than ambition, a quiet testament to the empire's need for continuity over grandeur. Historians later described Wu Hong's final revelation as the unifying spirit that had guided the realm through each fleeting title, a reminder that leadership often rests on subtle presence more than loud proclamation. The city's streets resumed their evening market rhythm, lantern light flickering against stone walls as merchants counted coins with measured patience. Under the soft night sky, the capital exhaled, its people drifting toward sleep with the knowledge that even the most layered crowns can be set aside for the simple comfort of a shared hearth. The courtyard of the palace felt cool in the early dawn, the stone tiles still damp from the night's mist. Emperor Wu Hong, then known as the Radiant Sovereign, stepped onto the bamboo platform, his silk robe rustling softly. Courtiers whispered his new seal, a simple dragon uncurled, while lanterns glowed amber against the pale sky. The people in the market below adjusted their stalls, the scent of steamed rice rising like a quiet promise. In that moment, the empire seemed a patient page, waiting for the ink of a ruler who had already imagined 3 more names. The sun stretched thin, casting long shadows that touched the distant hills as the first chapter of his reign settled into the stone. Months later, the river's calm was broken by the clamor of foot soldiers marching from the western border. A rebellion, framed in crude banners and shouted slogans, pressed against the outer walls as the night grew colder. Wu Hong, now calling himself the Iron Regent, inspected the breached gate with steady hands, the iron of his sword catching the torchlight. The council's parchment trembled under his weight, each brushstroke of his new seal echoing a resolve to adapt. Villagers huddled in their homes, the hearth's fire flickering, while the distant drums beat a hesitant rhythm. Yet the emperor's voice, low and measured, reminded the soldiers that the kingdom's strength lay not in a single banner, but in the patience of its people. After the rebellion was subdued, the emperor announced his 3rd name, the Gentle Scholar, and convened the scholars in the garden pavilion. Lanterns swayed lazily above the low table, where ink pots glistened like quiet ponds, and the scholars' pens scratched slowly across fresh scrolls. It was oddly humorous that the same hands which once wielded a sword now dipped quills into ink, as if the empire itself were learning to write its own lullaby. The council recorded his speeches with a faint smile, noting the irony of a ruler who changed crowns as often as a farmer changed seasons. Courtiers exchanged subdued chuckles their eyes briefly meeting over teacups that steamed in the cool evening air. Even the palace's stone lions seemed to lean a little, their stone eyes softened by the soft glow of candlelight, as if amused by the emperor's quiet theater. When the fourth name, the silent beacon, was proclaimed, the emperor gathered the council one last time beneath the marble archway. The air was warm with the scent of sandalwood, and the distant choir of crickets whispered the night's consent. With a gentle sigh, Wu Hong stepped down from the throne, his feet touching the cool floorboards that had supported his many coronations. The council's scribes, their brushes moving deliberately, inscribed each of his 4 regnal titles beside a single line of his unchanging vision for peace. Servants carried tea in quiet trays, the porcelain clinking softly, while the emperor's robe folded neatly on a wooden chair, a silent testament to the end of an era. The palace settled into a steady rhythm, the echo of footsteps fading like a lullaby that had finally found its final note. In the years that followed, travelers paused at the palace's outer wall, feeling the mellow breeze that carried the faint aroma of old incense. Historians, with their faces blurred by the dim of candlelight, wrote about the emperor's capacity to reinvent himself without breaking the kingdom's heart. Children playing by the garden's pond watched frogs leap, unaware that the same pond had reflected 4 distinct crowns over decades. The realm's markets thrummed with ordinary trade, the same steady cadence that had once steadied a ruler's resolve. The legacy of the fourfold emperor lingered like a soft, warm blanket, reminding each generation that adaptability can be a quiet form of strength. And on quiet evenings, when the stars glimmered faintly above the terracotta roofs, the people fell asleep, knowing their history had been written in calm, steady breaths. In the mist-shrouded valley of Ardentia, the stone towers of the capital caught the first pale light as Prince Aldrich stood beside his father's empty throne. The sudden death of King Rowan had left the kingdom sliced into 3 uneasy factions: the northern warlords, the river merchants, and the southern clergy, who still whispered of old oaths. Aldrich sensed that his birth name, simple and unadorned, would not reach across the cracked loyalties that hung like damp banners in the great hall. On the day of his coronation, he announced a series of titles: the Lion of the North, the Peacemaker, and the Iron Hand, each one spoken aloud to the assembly of clinking armor and murmuring courtiers. The candle flames trembled as the names settled, and the air carried a faint scent of wet stone and fresh ink, suggesting a careful record of this new experiment in identity. The northern lords, accustomed to battle cries, received the Lion of the North as a challenge, and their rough hands tightened on the hilts of their swords while they whispered about pride and predatory power. In the South, merchants spread gossip that the peacemaker might be a thin veil for higher taxes, their ledgers rustling under the low arches of the market hall. The clergy, cloaked in wool, muttered that the iron hand sounded more like a punishment than a promise, and the distant toll of the cathedral bells seemed to echo their unease. Aldrich walked the corridors of the palace, feeling the cool marble under his feet, hearing the echo of footsteps that grew louder whenever a new nickname was uttered. Each phrase, intended as a bridge, produced a subtle fissure, and the kingdom's uneasy truce trembled like a candle flame in a draught. Over weeks, the nicknames slipped into everyday chatter, turning from solemn epithets into gentle jokes among the servants who called the king the lion when he asked for more firewood. The iron gauntlets he wore for ceremonial parades were often swapped for softer leather gloves when he signed peace treaties, and the court scribes recorded his signatures with a wry tilt of the quill. At a banquet, a minstrel sang a lilting ballad that praised the peacemaker for mediating a dispute over a spilled barrel of ale, and the audience chuckled as the king lifted his cup in modest approval. The northern barons, meanwhile, raised their banners with a small lion emblem that seemed more decorative than threatening. Its painted eyes staring back at the king with bemused patience. In the quiet of the library, the iron hand of authority felt oddly light, as if the very weight of power had been softened by the repeated, almost affectionate, mispronunciations of his own titles. One evening, after a day of council meetings that had rattled the palace shutters, Aldrich sat alone on the low stone bench by the great hearth, the fire casting a warm amber glow on his tired shoulders. A servant placed a steaming bowl of stew on the table, its scent of root vegetables and smoked meat mingling with the faint perfume of burned incense from the chapel door. The king watched the shadows dance across the tapestries, each movement whispering the names he had given himself, now reduced to the simple sound of wood settling and water cooling in the basin. In that quiet, the distinct titles no longer commanded attention. They merged into the rhythm of breath and the soft clink of spoon against bowl. The kingdom beyond the walls seemed to pause, as if the distant hooves of the northern cavalry were halted by the gentle hush of a night that promised rest. Years later, when Aldrich's hair had silvered like the mist that still curled around Ardentia's towers, he often walked the same corridor, feeling the familiar chill of stone beneath his boots. Children in the courtyard would gather around him, listening to the old king repeat the nicknames as bedtime verses, their eyes blinking slowly in the dim lantern light. He realized that the power he had tried to forge with grand titles had settled into the softer habit of being remembered in stories told over firelight, where the lion was a gentle murmur rather than a roar. The iron hand he once brandished now rested softly on the back of a wooden chair, its weight a reminder that authority, like a candle, burns steadier when shared. In the stillness of his final days, Aldrich understood that the kingdom's true cohesion lay not in the names etched on parchment, but in the quiet moments when people paused, listened, and let the past settle like dust on an ancient throne. In the early light of spring, Aldrich stood on the stone balcony of his newly crowned hall, the chill of stone under his fingertips matching the quiet resolve in his eyes. He had taken the name King Aldrich the Lion, a title he intended to echo across the valleys and riverbanks of his realm. With a soft rustle of parchment, he ordered heralds and troubadours to spread the epithets Lion of Justice, Keeper of the Dawn, Iron Fist through the kingdom's winding roads. The courtiers watched the banners unfurl, their colors warm terracotta against the pale sky, while the distant clang of blacksmiths formed a low background hum. In the courtyard, a baker brushed flour from his hands, the scent of fresh loaves mingling with the early breeze as the kingdom prepared for a subtle change of language. The air held a measured expectancy, as if the stone walls themselves were listening to the promise of a new name. Behind the vaulted arches of the council chamber, senior advisors gathered around a heavy oak table, their voices low enough that the crackling fire seemed louder. Some whispered that a self-bestowed nickname could bind the northern warlords, whose banners already bore a roaring lion, while others feared the title might sharpen the edge of their swords. In the north, warlords met in smoky great halls, the roar of their torches matching the imagined roar of a lion, and pledged loyalty to the new moniker with clinking tankards. Far to the south, merchants in market stalls counted coins under the amber glow of lanterns, hearing promises of peace and hoping the Keeper of the Dawn would bring steadier trade routes. Meanwhile, the mountain barons, perched on craggy passes, paced on cold stone terraces, their eyes narrowed at the iron fist echoing off the cliffs, uncertain if the metaphor would turn to steel upon their doors. The council's debate rose like a draft through the hall, the tension palpable in the slight tremor of a lute string left untouched. As the epithets traveled, a stray minstrel sang the lion's bravery in a tavern where the only beast was a stray cat curled beneath a wooden table. The northern warlords, expecting a fierce battle cry, found themselves negotiating over the price of wool, their swords set aside for a barter of blankets. The southern merchants, hearing the Keeper of the Dawn, sent a modest shipment of spices that arrived at sunrise. Yet the courier's horse arrived with a cough, reminding all that promises travel slower than the wind. The mountain barons, wary of the iron fist, received a forged iron kettle as a diplomatic gift. Its surface warm to the touch, but plainly intended for brewing tea, not for war. In the royal chambers, Aldrich watched the irony unfold with a quiet smile. The soft rustle of silk curtains matching the gentle sigh of the court's collective amusement. The subtle humor settled like dust on ancient tapestries, unnoticed by none, but felt by all. Over the weeks, the disparate threads of loyalty began to weave a quieter tapestry. The clang of armor softened by the steady rhythm of market haggles. In the palace garden, gardeners tended rosemary and lavender, their hands feeling the cool earth as the sun slipped toward evening, while distant horns barely whispered across the fields. Counselors, once tense, now shared modest meals of broth and bread, the steam rising in lazy curls that brushed their weary faces. The northern warlords sent envoys bearing furs. The southern merchants delivered silk ribbons, and the mountain barons contributed carved pine bowls, each offering a gentle reminder of shared humanity. The court's great hall resonated with a low murmur of conversation, the occasional soft laugh echoing like a feather landing on an old tome. By nightfall, the palace walls held a warm amber glow, and the monarch, seated before a flickering candle, observed the steady pulse of his realm with a calm that felt as inevitable as the tide's return. In the quiet hours before dawn, Aldrich walked the quiet corridors, his steps muffled by worn stone, feeling the weight of names like a soft blanket draped over his shoulders. He sensed that the epithets, though crafted to consolidate power, had become quiet mirrors reflecting the modest desires of those they touched. The lion's roar had softened into a shared story, the iron fist into a warm kettle, and the keeper of dawn into the steady glow of countless hearths. The kingdom's rhythm settled into a gentle cadence, each village, and keep echoing the same subtle heartbeat that had once seemed distant. Aldrich paused by a small window, the chill of morning air brushing his cheek, and allowed himself a brief, weary smile, understanding that history often rests not on grand declarations, but on the soft, persistent breath of ordinary days. The palace, now still, held the faint scent of incense and fresh bread, a reminder that even a king's ambition can find its peace in the ordinary hush of everyday life. In the cool stone hall of the capital, King Aldrich the Lion Heart, also called the Silent Falcon, and the Iron Shepherd, walked among his courtiers with a measured stride, his cloak rustling like dried leaves. The banners above him bore 3 emblems, each one a quiet reminder of a name he used when negotiating with merchants, rallying troops, or receiving foreign envoys. Servants brushed copper pans and polished iron hinges, the sound a soft metronome to the king's whispered speeches. Though the people whispered about his many titles, they also admired the steady temperature of his presence. Like a hearth that never flickered, the kingdom, wrapped in a late summer haze, seemed to accept the layered identity as simply another stone in its long wall of tradition. A sharper wind began to stir the western ramparts when Count Mayern, a man with a quick smile and a voice that carried across tavern tables, gathered a handful of dissatisfied nobles. He pointed out that a ruler who adopts 3 masks may hide his true intentions, arguing that a single, steadfast name steadies the heart of a realm. The Count's words echoed in the low candlelight of the council chamber, the crackle of the fire punctuating each claim of deceit. Mirrors in the hall reflected the flickering flames, catching the glint of armor as Mayern's followers silently nodded. Tension rose like a low tide, measured but undeniable, as the nobles whispered among themselves, feeling the chill of uncertainty settle on their shoulders. Soon the hills beyond the border heard the clatter of hooves and the thud of wooden shields as Mayern's raiders slipped through night mist, exploiting the confusion between the king's titles. A messenger bearing the seal of the Iron Shepherd was intercepted by a band that recognized only the banner of the Silent Falcon, and the resulting miscommunication left a village porch empty of guards. The raiders moved with a quiet efficiency, the sound of their armor a soft rustle against the cool grass, while the villagers, confused by the overlapping proclamations, huddled in darkened doorways. Ironically, the very multiplicity the king had cultivated became a map for the rebels, each nickname a waypoint for their strategy. The irony rested not in overt chaos, but in the gentle, almost bureaucratic way the kingdom's own paperwork turned against it. As dawn painted the sky in muted ochre, the border towns sent smoke signals that rose like slow breaths, a calm indicator of the unsettling raids. The kingdom's unity, once as smooth as a well-polished shield, began to show tiny fissures that caught the morning light. Farmers lowered their shutters, feeling the cool stone of their walls against their fingertips, while traders adjusted their ledgers, noting the subtle loss of trust in the king's many personas. Yet the daily rhythm persisted. Children still chased sparrows in the courtyard. The blacksmith's hammer struck rhythmically, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the ovens. The overall atmosphere remained composed, as if the realm were a river that had merely shifted its course by a few centimeters, unnoticed by those wading in its shallows. Years later, when the king's reign had settled into a quiet archive, historians examined the parchment that listed Aldrich's 3 names side by side, noting the fleeting rebellion as a footnote rather than a rupture. The kingdom recalled the episode not with outrage, but with a soft chuckle, the memory of Myron's sharp smile lingering like the faint aroma of winter herbs. The lesson, whispered by aging scribes, suggested that power need not be a single banner, but a tapestry woven from many threads, each thread visible yet inseparable from the whole. In the Museum of Memory, the stone hall stood unchanged, its walls still warm to the touch, the echo of footsteps, a reminder that history often moves at the pace of a sigh. Thus the story settled into the collective sleep of the people, a gentle reminder that even multiplicity can find harmony when the world learns to listen to the quiet spaces between names. In the pale dawn that lingered over Greyhold, the stone walls caught the cool mist like a breath held between stones. King Aldrich stood on the rampart, his cloak dyed a muted green, and the court murmured about the many names he carried: lion, peacemaker, iron hand, each bestowed in quieter moments of council. The courtyard echoed with the soft scrape of armor as courtiers adjusted buckles, the scent of burning wood drifting from the hearth. Aldrich's eyes traced the distant ridge where Myron's banners were already a faint speck against the sky. He felt the weight of his titles settle like warm wool on his shoulders, a reminder that identity could be both armor and burden. The day began with a measured steadiness, as though history itself were turning a page with a careful hand. By mid-morning, the ground trembled under the hooves of Myron's men, their standards snapping in the wind like restless birds. The air grew sharper, the clink of steel and the low murmur of soldiers forming a low-frequency hum that settled in the belly of the fortress. Aldrich slipped into his first guise, the lion, and led the vanguard with a measured roar that sounded more like a steady drumbeat than a battle cry. His sword flashed, its steel catching the sun in brief, bright glints that fell upon the faces of the defenders. The siege engines creaked as they were wheeled forward, the iron limbs of the machines humming with anticipation. Tension pressed against the stone, but the rhythm of the conflict unfolded with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. As the assault pressed on, Aldrich shifted his mantle, stepping forward as the peacemaker, his voice low and even, offering clemency to any who would lay down arms. The promise lingered in the air like a faint perfume, confusing the attackers who paused to listen, unsure whether surrender or resistance served them best. Meanwhile, the iron hand took command of the trebuchets, his fingers moving with precise, almost tender deliberation over the massive ropes, the weight of each counterweight feeling like a pulse against his palm. The the rebels found themselves tangled in a tapestry of personas, each one a different melody that made their own plans stumble. A subtle irony settled over the battlefield as the king's layered identity became a fog that blurred the enemy's sight as much as the morning mist had done earlier. The sounds of metal striking stone were interlaced with the soft rustle of banners. A quiet comedy of misdirection played out in earnest steel when the sun began its slow descent. The clamor of war softened to a distant rumble, the siege engines sighing as they were lowered, their wooden bodies cooling in the evening air. Smoke rose thinly from the charred walls, drifting lazily like a curtain being drawn back over the day's drama. Aldrich, now simply a man in a simple dark tunic, walked among the defenders, feeling the rough texture of the stone under his fingertips, hearing the muted conversations of soldiers sharing stale bread, the layered nicknames that had become weapons, now settled like a gentle blanket over the fortress, shielding its inhabitants not with force, but with the quiet certainty of a known presence. A faint lullaby of crickets began beyond the walls, and the night air carried the faint scent of damp earth and fresh ash. In that stillness, the siege seemed less a clash of armies than a brief ripple on an otherwise steady pond. Later, as torches flickered low and the night deepened, Aldrich lingered on the battlements, his gaze tracing the long shadows that stretched across the courtyard. He reflected on how each nickname had been a tool, a simple word that had guided actions as surely as any blade, yet also a reminder of the fickle nature of power. The iron taste of rain on his tongue mingled with the memory of the day's iron-handed commands, an echo of the modest certainty that human deeds are often clothed in titles. He thought of the rebels, their confusion now softened into a quiet resignation, and felt a gentle melancholy for the countless stories that would be folded into Greyholt's stone. The night wrapped the fortress in a soft, beige glow, and the king, unnamed and named all at once, let the silence settle like a warm blanket over his thoughts. In that moment, the history of the siege became a still, unhurried breath, a reminder that identity, like sleep, is both shield and sigh. In the late autumn of Aldrich's reign, the stone walls of the capital hummed with the soft clatter of market stalls and the distant toll of the clock tower, while the king walked the courtyard in a cloak of muted green. He was known by many names: Aldrich the Stern, the Lion-Hearted, the Quiet Bear, each whispered differently by the farmers, the guildsmen, and the distant barons. The air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh bread, and the murmurs of those who called him varied like the colors of the sunrise. He had taken these nicknames on a whim, curious about the way a single sound could paint a distinct portrait. As twilight settled, the stone steps grew cool under his boots, and the kingdom seemed to listen, waiting for the next syllable. The beginning of his story lay in the simple act of being called many things at once. Soon, the multiplicity of names became a tinderbox. A faction of northern lords, calling him lion-hearted, felt slighted when their summons arrived signed as the quiet bear. The banners of rebellion rose, their fabric rustling like restless leaves, and the clash of steel rang through the valley, echoing off the stone towers. In the heated tents of battle, Aldrich answered each accusation with the name the aggrieved party preferred, his voice shifting as subtly as the wind. Drums beat a relentless rhythm, and the scent of iron mingled with cold rain that fell upon the field. Yet, the confusion of identities also fractured the rebels' resolve, as each group argued over which title truly held authority. By nightfall, the rebellion lay quiet, smothered not just by swords, but by the strange unity of a king who could be many and yet remained singular. When the dust settled, the irony of the situation unfolded within the great hall where candles flickered against the stone, casting blurred shadows over faces that seemed hidden by light. Aldrich gathered the humbled nobles around a long oak table, his hand resting on a simple wooden cup that reflected the amber glow. He spoke slowly, explaining that each nickname had been a deliberate thread sewn into the tapestry of loyalty, granting every faction a private claim to the crown. The nobles listened, their expressions softening as a faint smile traced the corners of their mouths, the irony palpable in the quiet hum of understanding. The blurred faces of the older advisors lingered in the periphery, unseen yet present, as the king's words settled like warm dust on the floorboards. In that moment, the art of naming revealed itself as a subtle instrument of power, turning potential division into a quiet harmony. The council moved with a measured calm. The crack of the fireplace wood accompanied the steady rhythm of pens scratching parchment, each stroke recording a pledge of fealty. The nobles, now bearing the weight of their chosen titles, placed their hands upon the same ancient stone, the cool surface grounding their vows. Aldrich, seated upon a modest wooden throne, wore a simple tunic of muted brown, his crown reduced to a thought, while his many names echoed softly around the room. The scent of stale bread and fresh herbs drifted from the kitchen doorway, mingling with the faint perfume of lavender sachets placed on the tables. Outside, the night settled in a gentle blanket of temperature. The world hushed as the kingdom settled into an unprecedented stability. The hall resonated with a serene certainty, as if the very walls breathed a contented sigh. Years later, chroniclers traced the legend of the king, who wore many names like layers of faded cloth, their quills leaving faint ink on parchment that smelled of time and quiet. The kingdom's archives preserved the tale with a reverent slowness, each entry a small, steady ripple in the flow of history. The story reminded those who read it of humanity's tendency to seek identity in symbols, yet also of the gentle absurdity of using those symbols to bind together fractured hearts. Aldrich's many faces, once distinct, now blended into a single, softened shadow that lingered over the annals of the realm. As the candle flames dwindled, the night air grew cool, and the kingdom rested under a blanket of stars, its people lulled by the soft hum of enduring peace. History, ever patient, closed its pages with a sigh, leaving the memory of a ruler who mastered power through the quiet art of names. In the autumn of the 9th year, the jade throne was lowered from its velvet cushion and presented to Wu, whose robe brushed the polished stone floor with a soft rustle. The courtyard filled with the steady beat of drums, the scent of incense curling around the bronze bells, and the murmur of scholars reciting verses near the lacquered screens. As the emperor lifted his hand, the lacquered seal of Jianyuan was pressed into the wax, marking a fresh beginning that felt as crisp as the early morning air. Courtiers watched the ink dry, their eyes reflecting the amber lantern light, while the common folk gathered at the city gates to hear the proclamation. The proclamation promised unity, and the distant hills seemed to echo the quiet confidence of the new era. Yet, a subtle chill settled in the shadows, hinting that the path ahead would be measured in steps as deliberate as the brushstroke that named the era. Within months, messages arrived from the Northern Command. The clatter of armored boots on packed roads carrying reports of restless border tribes. The emperor sat in the cool marble hall, the weight of the silk tassels on his sleeves feeling heavier as he listened to the scribe's urgent ink strokes. A storm of petitions swirled around the council, each voice a thin thread of concern tugging at the fabric of Jianyuan. To address the growing tension, Wu announced a change, replacing the era name with Yunshu, a gesture meant to reset expectations like a sunrise after a lingering night. The hall filled with a soft sigh, the incense smoke rising in steady curls as officials adjusted their seals, and the court's rhythm shifted imperceptibly. Even the courtyard gardens seemed to pause, the bamboo leaves rustling with a quiet curiosity about the new designation. Soon after, the promise of Yunshu faded under the same weight of tax rolls, and the distant echo of laborers' chants in the fields. The emperor, eyes half closed against the waning light, observed that the same petitions resurfaced, their words unchanged despite the freshly carved characters on the palace tablets. In a moment of quiet irony, he proclaimed yet another era name, Chengping, as though a new label could unclench the stubborn knots of governance. The scholars, perched on low stools, exchanged glances that held both amusement and resignation, their inkpots spilling faint specks onto parchment. The court's corridors carried the soft shuffle of shoes, the rustle of silk, while outside the market stalls continued their trade, indifferent to the emperor's linguistic overhaul. The city's lanterns flickered, casting shadows that danced over the stone steps, mirroring the fleeting nature of titles against the steadiness of daily life. As the seasons turned, the frequency of renaming settled into a rhythm that the people learned to accommodate like the regular toll of a distant bell. The emperor's voice softened, its timbre matching the gentle flow of the river that curved past the palace walls, and the new era name, Xingyuan, was whispered more as a quiet acknowledgement than a proclamation. Courtiers adjusted their schedules, the scribe's brushes moving with a measured patience, and the palace kitchens emitted the warm aroma of simmering broth that soothed the lingering edge of uncertainty. Children played near the garden pavilions, their laughter weaving through the rustle of willow leaves, while elders rested on stone benches, content with the steady hum of daily chores. The air held a mellow temperature, balancing the lingering chill of early mornings with the soft heat of afternoon suns, and the court ceremonies proceeded with a calm that felt like a well-worn blanket. In these moments, the empire's grand narratives receded, leaving behind the simple cadence of ordinary tasks that continued unabated. Decades later, when the bamboo scrolls were unrolled in the quiet study of a later librarian, the pattern of 7 era names unfolded like a muted chorus of intention and adjustment. The historian's fingertips traced the faded characters, feeling the texture of centuries, and noted the subtle lesson that each new name was less a transformation than a reminder of humanity's habit of seeking freshness in familiar cycles. The palace courtyard, now softened by moss and the scent of distant rain, stood as a testament to endurance, its stone steps bearing the imprint of countless footsteps that never paused for grand declarations. The lingering quiet held a gentle melancholy, an awareness that even emperors, draped in silk and authority, were bound by the same ordinary threads that stitched together streets, kitchens, and fields. In the hush between breaths, the story settled into a reflective stillness, inviting the listener to rest and contemplate the modest continuity beneath the veneer of change. And as the lanterns dimmed, their amber glow faded into night, leaving behind the soft echo of a calm that had endured beyond any era name. In the early morning mist of the imperial palace, the emperor sat on a lacquered throne, while attendants unfolded silk banners bearing the latest era name. The scent of incense curled lazily around the marble columns, and servants whispered the new syllables that would mark the calendar for the next year. Each change, though bureaucratic, was recorded in the quiet ledgers, a reminder that time itself was being reshaped by the ruler's hand. The court moved with measured steps, the rustle of sandalwood, shoes barely audible over the distant hum of the river beyond the walls. Inside the great hall, the emperor's gaze lingered on the faded frescoes, as if seeking counsel from the quiet past. Soon the polished corridors filled with the low murmur of rival factions, their voices slipping through lattice screens like thin drafts. Ministers from the northern provinces exchanged folded notes, while eunuchs in lacquered cuffs passed secret glances, each aware that a single uttered word could shift the balance of power. The emperor watched the flickering lamplight catch on polished armor, feeling the subtle pressure of ambition pressing against the cool stone floor. A messenger arrived with a sealed scroll, its seal bearing the emblem of a distant warlord, and the air grew heavier with the scent of rain on the courtyard tiles. The palace gardens, usually a refuge of calm bamboo, seemed to hold its breath as whispers of dissent settled like dew. In response to the growing discord, the emperor announced a new era name, Yuanguang, intending it to be a beacon of renewed harmony. Its characters painted in bright vermilion on the palace doors. Yet irony arrived quietly. As the crown prince fell ill after a banquet where honeyed wine glistened like amber, the taste of betrayal lingering on his tongue. The court physicians whispered about a faint scent of bitter herbs, and the emperor felt the chill of stone beneath his fingertips as he examined the empty lacquer bowl. Outside, the frontier troops sharpened spears in the dim light, their motions steady despite the unrest within the capital. The emperor's eyes lingered on the lanterns swaying gently, their flames flickering as if to mask the underlying tension. With the prince's fate sealed by a poisoned cup, the emperor retreated to the imperial library, where the rustle of bamboo scrolls offered a quieter rhythm than the clamor of advisors. He traced the worn characters of previous era names with a fingertip, feeling the coolness of the paper and the faint dust that rose like sighs. The night wind brushed against the lattice windows, carrying the distant sound of distant drums. Yet inside the study, a simple tea ceremony unfolded, the steam rising in soft curls as the emperor sipped the warm brew. The weight of betrayal settled like a gentle stone in his palm, and the court's intrigues seemed distant, muffled by the steady ticking of the hourglass. The candlelight cast long shadows that danced lazily across the wooden beams. A quiet reminder that even turmoil could be wrapped in stillness. In the years that followed, the emperor would change the era name 6 more times, each alteration recorded with the same measured hand that once penned Yunguang. He would often pause by the palace pond, watching koi glide beneath the surface, their movements reflecting a world that continued despite human scheming. The soft rustle of reeds made a gentle accompaniment to his thoughts, and he sensed that history, like the evening breeze, retained its calm after the storm. Looking back, he recognized that the repeated renamings were less about asserting power than about coping with the inevitable imperfection of those who surrounded him. With a sigh as light as the falling cherry blossom petals, he accepted the rhythm of rise and decline, and the palace settled into a quiet that felt, at last, like a long-awaited sigh of relief. The second emperor of the Han, known to history as Wu, began his reign under the banner of a new era name that promised renewal. In the capital, officials brushed dust from bronze tablets while courtiers sipped lightly scented tea, their whispers lingering like the faint hum of a distant drum. Beyond the city walls, young soldiers tightened leather straps on their armor, feeling the cool morning air brush against their backs. The emperor, seated beneath a lacquered canopy, watched the sunrise paint the palace roof a soft amber, his eyes reflecting a quiet resolve. At that moment, the world seemed poised for orderly progress, as if the seasons themselves had been asked to wait. Yet the northern steppes carried the restless hooves of the Xingnu, and their arrows thudded against the wooden palisades of frontier forts. Night in the border towns was pierced by the crackle of firelight as watchmen exchanged tired glances, the chill of the steppe wind seeping through their coats. Simultaneously, uprisings flickered in the southern valleys, where peasants loosened the tassels of their coarse hemp garments and muttered about grain shortages. The emperor received reports on parchment that felt heavy as stone, each line a reminder of dwindling supplies and mounting fatigue. In council chambers, the rustle of silk sleeves accompanied the low murmur of advisors weighing strategies against the slow tick of an oil lamp. The atmosphere grew taut, like a drumskin stretched too thin, while the court struggled to keep its composure. In response, Wu declared a succession of era names: Yuanfeng, Yuanli, Yuanxi, each a polished phrase meant to stir courage and quiet doubt. The proclamations were read aloud in market squares, the words echoing off stalls of millet and the soft clink of copper coins. Yet the same hands that signed the edicts also stained their sleeves with ink, a subtle reminder that words alone could not mend cracked walls. Soldiers marching toward the frontier adjusted the ribbons on their caps, the new titles fluttering like moth-sized flags in the wind, while the common folk whispered that the names sounded like hopeful lullabies after sleepless nights. The irony lay in the quiet persistence of ordinary life, continuing as if the changing names were merely background noise. As the seasons turned, a slower rhythm settled over the empire, and the once sharp clang of swords softened to the rhythmic scrape of wooden pestles in kitchens. In the palace gardens, the emperor walked barefoot on the cool stone paths, feeling the moss damp beneath his feet, while courtiers tended to chrysanthemums that opened with a reluctant sigh. Merchants arranged their wares with measured care, the scent of dried persimmon mingling with the faint aroma of incense burning low. The treasury's ledgers grew thin, yet scribes continued to ink numbers with deliberate strokes, the ink drying like a quiet river on parchment. Night fell over the capital, and the lanterns cast a mellow amber glow that washed over the courtyards, a gentle reminder that even exhausted kingdoms find moments of peace. The people, accustomed to the rise and fall of proclamations, learned to read the subtle changes in temperature and light as the true markers of time. Later, when the emperor's bronze statue stood half covered in moss, historians traced the sequence of era names as a modest chronicle of human perseverance. Visitors to the temple felt the cool stone beneath their palms, the echo of distant drumbeats now softened to a distant heartbeat. The empire's borders, though still marked by weathered watchtowers, no longer shouted with the same urgency, their silhouettes blending into the horizon's pale mist. In quiet contemplation, the people recognized that names could be changed, but the steadiness of daily breath, the rustle of silk, and the whisper of wind over wheat fields endured. The legacy of Wu's 7 era names became a gentle lesson. History moves forward, not through grand declarations alone, but through the patient accumulation of ordinary moments. In the waning light of the imperial courtyard, Wu, a ruler known for his restless mind, stood before the bronze mirror that reflected his ever-changing titles. Over the years, he had renamed his reign 7 times, each era name stamped onto lacquered tablets that slid like quiet whispers across the archives. The scholars, accustomed to the soft clatter of brush on bamboo, recorded each shift with patient hands, noting the subtle shift in tone as if cataloging seasons. Outside, the palace garden breathed a mellow scent of plum blossoms, their petals drifting like muted applause for the emperor's latest decision. Yet in the background, the low murmur of distant granaries hinted that the empire's fortunes were measured more by grain than by names. Wu smiled faintly, aware that the next ink stroke would soon find its own place among the layered histories. As the summer heat settled into a dry, cracked earth, the stored rice turned brittle, and the market stalls echoed with hushed complaints of empty bowls. The famine spread like a thin veil of dust, coating the streets of the capital in a quiet desperation that made the lanterns seem dimmer. In the shadowed corridors of the eastern barracks, a group of disgruntled commanders whispered of a coup, their words slipping through stone arches like stale wind. Their plan, though half formed, pulsed with the restless energy of those who felt the empire's pulse had stalled. Courtiers heard the faint thud of hurried hooves as messengers rode to warn the throne, their saddles creaking against the night stillness. The tension, thin as the sigh of an old pine, settled over the palace, pressing against the lacquered doors without breaking them on a night when the moon hung low and pale over the palace roof. Wu summoned his advisors to the jade-carved hall and, with a steady hand, inscribed the character Yongle, eternal brightness, upon a fresh bamboo slip. The irony of declaring everlasting light, while the granaries whispered of darkness, was not lost on the observers, whose eyes flickered with a mixture of amusement and caution. A quiet chuckle passed through the room, as if the ink itself hinted that names could not alone chase away hunger. Yet Wu's voice, calm as a river stone, pledged that the new era would be a lantern, guiding the people through the lingering cold. The proclamation resonated through the marble corridors, its echo soft enough to blend with the distant clatter of cooking pots. In that moment, the court felt the gentle sway between hope and the inevitable weight of reality, a balance as delicate as a teacup balancing on a saucer. Before dawn broke, Wu donned a plain linen robe and rode out of the eastern gate, the wooden wheels of his cart turning with measured creak over the dew-wet road. The fields stretched ahead, a tapestry of withered stalks that brushed his boots with a dry rustle. Yet the emperor's presence seemed to soften the wind's bite. He walked among the peasants, listening to the low murmur of their conversations about cracked bowls and the occasional laugh that rose like a faint lantern flame. When the rebel forces emerged from the hills, Wu stood beside his soldiers, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, a gesture that felt more like a reassurance than a command. The clash was brief, the clanging of steel subdued, and soon the rebels fell back, their banners folding silently onto the earth. After the dust settled, Wu remained seated on a low stool, sipping warm tea as the sun painted the sky in muted amber, the scene unfolding with an unhurried dignity. In the weeks that followed, the granaries were refilled slowly, the scent of fresh rice rising from the warehouses like a promise whispered to the night. The people, now accustomed to the quiet rhythm of renewed harvests, gathered in the market squares to share simple meals. The clatter of wooden bowls, a gentle reminder of perseverance. Wu, whose name had shifted 7 times, watched from his study as the ink on the Yongle tablets dried, its sheen catching the soft glow of oil lamps. He reflected on the odd symmetry of his reign, a ruler who chased brilliance with ink, yet found his steadiness in the mundane act of walking among his subjects. The palace courtyards, once echoing with the frantic scribbles of era changes, now held only the faint rustle of silk and the occasional sigh of wind through bamboo. In that lingering calm, history seemed to yawn, folding the episode of famine and rebellion into a quiet chapter, reminding all who read it that even the brightest names are born from ordinary shadows. In the early light of spring, the palace courtyard echoed with the soft rustle of silk banners as Emperor Wu walked among the courtiers who had just quelled the northern rebellion. The scent of rain, damp stone mingled with the distant clatter of carpenters repairing the granaries that had been damaged in the siege. Wu listened to the murmurs of officials reporting the first signs that the famine was easing, their voices low and cautious like a wind through bamboo. He paused by the stone basin, feeling the cool water slip through his fingertips, and allowed the modest relief to settle like a quiet breath. The day unfolded with a gentle rhythm, each step measured as the empire steadied itself after turmoil. Yet the relief felt tentative, as if the cracked earth beneath the fields still remembered the thirst of the past months. Wu observed the farmer's hands, calloused and stained, moving grain sacks with a steady, almost weary cadence that spoke of lingering uncertainty. The treasury's ledgers were spread on a low table, the ink smudged by dampness, revealing a balance that hovered between surplus and deficit. In the council hall, the soft thud of wooden doors opening punctuated discussions about tax adjustments. Each suggestion weighed like a stone in a shallow stream. The emperor's eyes, though calm, traced the flicker of oil lamps that seemed to sputter in response to each proposal, mirroring the fragile hope of the people. Outside, the wind brushed the palace eaves, reminding him that stability was a fragile construct, easily shifted by a single misguided decree. It was amid this careful negotiation that Wu recalled the 7 era names he had adopted over his reign, each one a quiet signal to the world that the mandate could be reshaped without fanfare. The first name had arrived with bold fireworks, the second with a modest rain ceremony, and the subsequent titles were announced in hushed court meetings, their meanings as subtle as the change of a tea's temperature. Court scribes noted the transitions with a faint smile, their brushes dancing across parchment, as if amused by the emperor's willingness to rename the calendar like a tailor adjusting a hem. The irony lay in the fact that while the heavens remained indifferent, the people adjusted their daily rhythms to match each new proclamation. As if the era name could coax the soil to yield more rice, Wu watched the palace maid sweep the hallway, her broom making a soft, repetitive sound that seemed to echo the cadence of these 7 names. Each sweep a reminder of change wrapped in ordinary motion. When the final proclamation was issued, Wu retired the Yongle era with a quiet ceremony that involved no grand fireworks, only the gentle clink of jade cups being set down on lacquered tables. He spent evenings on the terrace, the cool night air brushing his cheeks as the distant river sang a low, steady murmur. The palace gardens, now flushed with the pale glow of lanterns, offered a place where he could watch the soft rustle of bamboo leaves and feel the earth's subtle warmth through the stone steps. In these moments, his thoughts lingered on the modest lives of the villagers who tended their fields, their silhouettes moving slowly against the amber horizon. The emperor's heart settled into a rhythm as even as the ticking of the palace clock, each tick a reminder that power, like a candle, yields its light more gently when not forced to blaze. Reflecting on the tapestry of 7 names, Wu understood that a ruler's strength resides not in unwavering constancy, but in the humility to revise destiny when the people's breath grows shallow. He wrote a brief note, its ink dry and faint, urging future successors to listen to the quiet sounds of grain being stored and the subtle sighs of tired hands. The palace walls, brushed with the soft patina of age, seemed to absorb his words, holding them like a warm blanket against the night chill. As the moon rose, casting a mellow amber hue over the courtyards, the emperor felt a calm acceptance, knowing his legacy would be measured not by the grandeur of proclamations, but by the steadiness of daily life he helped sustain. In the end, the 7 names blended into a single melody, a lullaby of adaptation that whispered through generations. In the late heat of an Al-Mazrah afternoon, the marble echo of the palace courtyard whispered the arrival of the new sultan, Alim ibn Zahir, whose robe brushed the sun-warmed stones. The council of elders gathered around the central fountain, its water cool against the still air, as Alim lifted his hand and declared himself Alim the Unifier, with a voice that trembled like a reed in a gentle wind. He spoke of expanding beyond the endless dunes, of stitching together the scattered oasis towns into a single tapestry of trade and law. The first thread, he said, would be the neighboring city of Qasr al-Nar, whose white walls rose like a mirage against the desert horizon. As the sun began to dip, the scent of cumin and baked flatbread drifted through the colonnades, grounding the lofty ambition in the everyday breath of the people. Alim's eyes, steady yet uncharted, lingered on the map spread before him, and the chapter of his reign seemed, in that moment, both a promise and a quiet invitation to the future. The royal caravan set out before dawn, the camels' padded steps rustling the sand like distant drums, while the desert wind carried a dry, metallic scent of distant stones. Behind Alim, the council's muted murmurs rose and fell, each advisor weighing the weight of their swords against the thin veneer of confidence. As they approached the pale silhouette of Qasr al-Nar, its crenellated towers caught the first light, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of resistance. The heat pressed against the soldiers' helmets, and the heat-baked earth clung to their boots, making each step a small surrender to the relentless sun. Yet the Sultan's calm voice, low as a desert creek, urged patience, reminding his men that the true battle was for hearts as much as for walls. A sudden gust lifted a handful of sand into the sky, momentarily obscuring the city and stirring a brief, collective breath of uncertainty among the troops. When the siege ladders finally touched the stone of Qasr al-Nar, the first echo that rose was not the clash of steel, but the soft splash of water from an unnoticed well at the base of the wall. The defending archers, expecting a roar of arrows, paused to drink, their throats grateful for the coolness that the attackers had also coveted. In that absurd pause, Alim's prized war horse slipped on the slick stones, stumbling into a shallow pool, and sending a spray that dampened the Sultan's ceremonial cloak. The council, watching the scene through a lattice of latticework, could not help but smile at the gentle mockery of fate. As the title Alim the Unifier felt suddenly misaligned with the soggy circumstance, Alim, with a barely audible chuckle, allowed himself the modest new epithet, Alim the Unforeseen, acknowledging that conquest often arrives wrapped in ordinary mishaps. The siege continued not with thunderous bombardment, but with a quiet barter of water, dates, and stories exchanged across the walls, turning potential violence into an unexpected communion. By the following twilight, a tentative truce was inked on parchment that smelled faintly of citrus oil, the ink dark as the desert night sky. Merchants from both sides set up stalls beneath the lanterns that swayed gently, their lamps casting amber pools on the stone streets where children shuffled barefoot, their laughter a soft rustle against the cool evening air. Alim, now seated on a low cushion beside the fountain, watched the water ripple in steady circles, each wave reflecting a lantern's flame, as if the world had settled into a slow, breathing rhythm. The title Alim the Unifier etched on the newly raised banner seemed less a proclamation of power than a reminder of the fragile threads that bind societies together. In the distance, the desert wind carried the scent of sandalwood, and the palace's stone walls, warm from the day's heat, released a faint, comforting sigh. The night deepened, and the Sultan's hand rested lightly on a cup of spiced tea, feeling the thin steam rise like a quiet promise that tomorrow would be another measured step. Years later, when the sands had softened the outlines of former battle lines, Alim would sit on the same stone bench, his beard brushed with the pale dust of countless mornings. He would watch apprentices weave carpets, their looms ticking softly, each thread a reminder that titles are as fleeting as the patterns they adorn. The courtyard, now hushed by the gentle hum of crickets, offered a space where the Sultan could hear his own heartbeat echo against the cool marble, a rhythm more constant than any conquest. In that stillness, he understood that the crown he bore was less a weight and more a quiet habit of dressing, changing with each sunrise and each humbled moment. The blurred silhouettes of ancient prophets, imagined only as shadows beyond the arches, reminded him that history records deeds while veiling intention, leaving a soft margin for humility. With a sigh that matched the sigh of the desert wind, Alim let the title slip from his tongue, allowing the night to settle around him like a gentle blanket. Content that the story of his reign would be retold in low voices and sleepy smiles. In the early heat of the season, Sultan Alim surveyed the endless sweep of pale sand with a calm that seemed as old as the dunes themselves, his gaze lingering on the faint ripple of a far-off mirage. The court's messengers arrived on camelback, their leather straps creaking, bearing reports of a rival warlord, safe of the red dunes, whose banners had begun to flutter near the western edge of the kingdom. Alim's advisors, robed in softened linen, whispered about supply lines and the thinness of water in the desert, their voices low as the wind that brushed the sand-covered walls. He accepted the challenge with a measured nod, allowing the desert night to settle over the camp, the scent of frankincense mixing with dry earth. As the sun set, a thin line of fire traced the horizon, marking the beginning of a campaign that would later be recorded in the quiet margins of history. The march through the dunes grew wearisome, each step stirring grains that clung to skin and leather, while the sun drummed a relentless rhythm on the soldiers' shields. Saif's forces, hidden among the crimson dunes, launched sudden raids that sent brief bursts of dust into the air, the clatter of steel echoing like distant thunder. Nights were spent beneath canvas, where campfires whispered stories of past battles, while the scent of baked flatbread rose softly. Yet the thin veil of sleep was often broken by the distant howl of a wind that seemed to carry messages of warning. Supplies thinned, and the men's breath became a visible reminder of the desert's chill as the night deepened. Still, Alem kept his composure, his silhouette barely noticeable against the stark moonlight, as the siege of the oasis loomed ahead like an unspoken promise. When the siege finally gave way to a tentative surrender, the oasis revealed itself not as a bounty of abundance, but as a modest pool of brackish water, its surface rippling under a pale sunrise that painted the sand in shades of amber. The victorious soldiers gathered around the shallow basin, their boots slipping on the wet edge, while Safe's banners were lowered with the soft sigh of fabric rustling in a gentle breeze. In the quiet after the clash, Alem was proclaimed, Alem the Conqueror of Waters, a title that sparked muted laughter among the courtiers, who noted the irony of celebrating a conquest of a scarce, barely drinkable spring. Within the tented council chamber, some nobles whispered dissent, their fingers tracing the grain of their wooden seats, uneasy at the prospect of a new name that seemed more ceremonial than substantive. Yet the Sultan accepted the epithet with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, acknowledging the subtle humor that history often gifts its leaders. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of repair and routine. Water barrels were stacked. Children chased each other around the palm trunks, and the scent of simmering stew drifted from the communal kitchen. The oasis, now guarded by a modest garrison, became a quiet gathering place where traders exchanged dates for dyed cloth, their voices low as the desert wind brushed the shutters. Alem observed the scene from a shaded balcony, the cool stone under his fingertips contrasting with the lingering heat of the sand below, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness as the sun lowered, casting long, gentle shadows. The nobles who had expressed doubt now sat side by side with the warlords, their conversations a low murmur that blended with the soft creak of wooden doors. In this calm, the kingdom seemed to inhale, its pulse steady, as if the sands themselves had paused to listen to the soft steps of ordinary life. As twilight deepened into night, Alem stood alone by the oasis. The stars reflected faintly in the water, their distant light softened by a veil of thin clouds. He thought of the many titles that had marked his reign, each a layer of expectation that rested lightly on his shoulders, like the fine dust that settled on his robes after a long day. The quiet murmurs of the water reminded him that conquest is often a ripple rather than a wave, and that the true measure of a ruler lies in the patience required to watch those ripples settle. He bowed his head, feeling the cool night air brush his cheek, and let the silence speak of impermanence, humility, and the gentle humor that history reserves for those who listen. With a final glance at the still pool, he turned back toward toward the camp, his steps measured, carrying the quiet assurance that tomorrow's titles would be earned as gently as the desert's breath. The morning light stretched thin across the palace courtyard as Alim traced the faded lines of an ancient map with a fingertip stained by ink. The parchment whispered of Jabal al-Sira, a spine of stone laced with silver veins that glimmered even in the dim. Courtiers watched the Sultan's gaze settle on the highlands, noting the steady rhythm of his breath as he imagined the wind among the peaks. He ordered a modest caravan of pack animals, each laden with stone tools and modest provisions, to follow the routes once marked by caravans of merchants long gone. The city's walls seemed to sigh, their stone cool against the rising sun, while the distant hills waited patient and indifferent as the convoy slipped into the gorge. The air grew thin and the stone walls narrowed, echoing with the clatter of hooves on gritty paths. Snow-kissed cliffs released a sudden gust that rattled the canvas, and the men felt the chill settle into their bones like a whispered warning. Ahead, the mountain clans, cloaked in woven wool, dyed the color of earth, arranged themselves along the ridge, their spears glinting in the weak sun. Their chief, a wiry figure named Harun, met Alim with a measured stare. The silence between them stretched like the rope of a drawn bow. A tense exchange of gifts, a shared bowl of tea, and the hesitant chorus of drums marked a fragile truce. Yet the shadows in the passes hinted that trust could crumble as easily as a cracked stone slab. When the first sunrise brushed the summit, Alim's forces found a narrow ledge littered with quartz that glimmered like spilled fire, a bounty that promised wealth beyond the palace's vaults. Yet the clans, having watched the Sultan's flag rise, retreated without clash, leaving behind only a silent echo of their footsteps and a modest basket of barley. The victory was recorded as a peaceful conquest, and Alim received the new title Keeper of Peaks, proclaimed by a low-voiced scribe, whose ink dripped lazily onto the scroll. The irony lay in how a title earned by the lack of blood now hung heavy on his shoulders, a reminder that power could be granted by quiet assent as much as by sword. In the evenings, the newly formed council gathered around a low fire, their conversations punctuated by the occasional clink of cups, while the mountain wind whispered through the cracks of their makeshift shelter. In the weeks that followed, the mountain valleys settled into a routine of shared labor, with craftsmen from the lowlands polishing stones, while the clans taught Alim's men to weave sturdy rope from goat hair. The market stalls that sprouted near the pass sold steaming flatbread, the scent of smoked lamb mingling with the crisp air, and children chased each other along stone steps, their laughter thin and unhurried. Nightly, Alim would sit on a worn wooden stool, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his boots, and watch the lanterns flicker like distant fireflies against the darkening cliffs. The title he wore felt less like a crown and more like a quiet responsibility, its embroidered script softened by the gentle breeze that brushed his cheek. Even the once steep passes seemed less intimidating, their paths now marked by the ordinary rhythm of footsteps and occasional sighs of tired travelers. As the season turned and the first frost laid a thin veil over the highlands, Alim reflected on the fleeting nature of his triumph, noting how the mountain's silence grew louder than any proclamation. He sensed that the alliance, like the fragile frost, could melt under the heat of ambition. Yet he also understood that the modest exchanges of grain and stone had forged a memory that would linger in the elders' stories. The title Keeper of Peaks remained etched on his seal, but the ink had slightly smeared, as if acknowledging the inevitable wear of time. In a quiet moment, he traced the ridgelines on the map once more, his fingers feeling the faint ridges as if they were the lines of an old friend's palm. The story that would be told to future listeners, he realized, would be less about conquest and more about the patient listening to a mountain's whisper. In the early light of a quiet summer, Sultan Alim stood upon the marble balcony of his citadel, his robe threaded with the deep green of the newly acquired valley and the faint gold of his latest honorifics, each title stitched like a quiet promise. The thin air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden below, where courtiers moved with the measured steps of a river's current, their whispers barely stirring the heat that rose from the stone floor. Alim's jewel crown, a delicate lattice of amber and turquoise set in polished silver, rested lightly against his brow, catching the sun in a soft, muted glow. Children in the courtyard practiced their calligraphy, their brushes scratching faintly against parchment, while the palace clock ticked a calm, steady beat. The scene felt like a paused breath, a moment before the world would shift without fanfare. By midday, a low rumble gathered on the horizon, the distant clatter of hooves, and the muted clang of armor echoing through the valley like an impatient rain. Disgruntled lords, their banners stained with dust, gathered under the banner of the exiled Prince Karim, whose face remained hidden in the shadows of a tattered veil as he spoke in hushed tones. The storm at dawn was not yet visible, yet the air grew cooler, and the scent of wet earth hinted at an approaching conflict. Alim observed the assembly from his high window, the soft rustle of his silk sleeves the only sound against the growing murmur of dissent. The tension settled like a thick fog, pressing against the palace walls without yet breaking them. When the armies finally met at the Twin Rivers, the water reflected the pale light of a reluctant sun, turning the battlefield into a mirror of muted colors. Alum, now bearing 4 ornate titles that curled around his name like ivy, rode forward with a measured cadence, his horse's hooves making a gentle thud against the soft mud. The irony of his ever-lengthening name was not lost on the observers. Each new honor seemed to weigh him down even as it lifted him higher in the eyes of his people. The clash was more a choreography of disciplined motions than a roar of fury. Spears tipped with dull iron brushed the air, and shields met with a muted clang that sounded almost like a sigh. Amid the measured exchange, Alum felt a quiet resolve forming, as steady as the river's flow beside him. As the sun slipped toward the western hills, a thin mist rose from the rivers, dampening the battlefield and softening the clamor into a distant hum. Alum lowered his sword, the metal cool against his palm, and extended a hand laden with his jewel crown, its amber stones catching the fading light in a gentle, weary glimmer. The offering was received with a hesitant nod, and the opposing commanders lowered their spears, the tension dissolving like mist under a warm lantern. The negotiated peace settled over the field like a blanket, the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets filling the quiet that followed. In that moment, the titles on Alum's tongue seemed less important than the simple weight of the crown he relinquished. A quiet sacrifice that resonated louder than any shout. Weeks later, the citadel returned to its ordinary rhythm. The courtyard once again echoed with the soft scrape of brushes on parchment, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen ovens. Alum walked the stone corridors barefoot, feeling the coolness of the tiles against his soles, his mind tracing the line of the rivers that had witnessed the conflict and the reconciliation. He reflected on the fleeting nature of honor, noting how each title had been a ripple, temporary, against the enduring flow of daily life. The people, now unburdened by the looming threat, gathered around simple tables, sharing stories over steaming tea, their faces relaxed and slightly amused by the memory of a storm that had never truly thundered. In the quiet twilight, Alum smiled faintly, understanding that history's greatest shifts often arrive wrapped in the soft hush of ordinary moments. In the early light of the desert dawn, a thin plume of sand rose from the courtyard, where Alum first lifted his sword, and the clink of metal echoed against stone walls. The young sultan, wrapped in a simple cotton turban, took the title Alum the Falcon, his eyes tracking the distant hills as caravans rattled past. Trade routes whispered of his ambition, and the scent of incense drifted from market stalls, where merchants counted their coins with careful fingers. Each sunrise brought a new frontier, and the quiet murmur of footfalls on plastered floors marked the slow expansion of his realm. The chronicle of his first conquest was recorded in ink that dried slowly, as if reluctant to rush the story forward. When the river's bend yielded to Alam's advance, the riverbanks resonated with the soft splash of oars and the muted cries of distant camps. He added the title Alam, the Tidebreaker, a name that felt heavier, like the damp cloth draped over his shoulders at night. The council chambers filled with the rustle of parchment as scribes noted every new border, their quills scratching against the grain of time. Soldiers returned with the faint scent of campfire smoke, and the stone arches seemed to sigh under the weight of triumph and fatigue. Yet beneath the celebration, a low hum of unease lingered, like the faint vibration of a drum heard from far away, reminding all that power, once claimed, demands constant attention. With each annexed village, Alam's titles grew in flourish. Alam the Dawn Keeper, Alam the Whispering Wind, each bestowed with a ceremonious chant that floated through vaulted halls like a lazy breeze. The irony settled in the quiet corners where bakers kneaded dough, their palms warm against the flour, unnoticed by the grandeur above. A council of elder artisans, whose hands were stained with clay, began to share counsel, their gentle murmur a counterpoint to the clamor of triumph. The palace garden, bathed in the amber glow of late afternoon, offered a place where the Sultan could watch sparrows perch on marble benches, their small movements almost comical against his lofty epithets. In this softened light, the titles seemed more decorative than decisive, a subtle joke whispered by history itself. When the final banner was raised on the northern plateau, the sky turned a mellow ochre, and the distant hills no longer echoed with the clamor of battle, but with the soft rustle of wheat fields swaying gently. Alam, now older and his beard tinged with the gray of many evenings, adopted the name Alam the Eternal Guardian, his voice steady as he addressed the assembled council beneath the vaulted dome. The council, comprised of former scribes, merchants, and master weavers, shared the weight of governance like a warm blanket draped over weary shoulders. In the quiet of the great hall, the sound of a lone lute string vibrating lingered, marking the transition from conquest to stewardship. The night settled with a calm that smelled of cool stone and faint jasmine, a reminder that the realm had found a steadier rhythm. Alam stood on the balcony, feeling the cool night air brush against his cheek, and he traced each of his former titles etched into the marble steps with a fingertip that had once known the texture of battle banners. He thought of the falcon, the tide, the dawn, and the wind, each a reminder of a moment when ambition eclipsed patience. now softened by the rhythm of daily chores in the palace courtyard. The council members, seated around low tables, passed teacups that steamed softly, their faces relaxed, eyes half closed, as if listening to a story already known. In this gentle hush, Alim sensed that the balance between conquest and care was not a line, but a quiet meadow, where footsteps could linger without haste. He resolved that future generations would learn, not from the roar of triumph, but from the muted echo of stewardship that lingered long after the banners were taken down.